in the interest of time, what I'll do is just start with the housekeeping to let you know that the working principles for this meeting are Chatham House rule, and also I need to draw your attention to the competition law statement, which I'm going to read out now. And if at any point you are concerned that we may be breaching it, please do let me know and I will pause and I will move us on. So the statement that I need to draw your attention to is that we agree to conduct this summit in a competition compliant manner, which will not involve any discussions, decisions, or subsequent behavioural change that may be construed as anti-competitive, nor shall we act in a manner that could be construed as advertising or promoting our own business or business concerns or soliciting for business or work. Competition law concerns can arise in a number of ways, including from the exchange of commercially sensitive information, from an agreement or a more general understanding, or decisions to boycott or to refuse to deal with certain businesses, agreements amongst competitors to impose unfair trading terms, as well as agreements which fix prices or which otherwise limit output and supply. Failure to adhere to these conditions will result in the premature termination of the webinar. So yeah, if at any point you're concerned about that, please let us know. So for now, and first off, the first thing I'm going to do is just explain the purpose of the session this afternoon. Thanks so much if any of you joined the session this morning. This morning we talked about the Scope 3 measurement and reporting protocols document that we issued for consultation earlier in January. And a recording of that session will be available if you missed it and you wanted to listen in. This session is all about data, and specifically data for purchased goods and specifically data for food and drink purchases. And the purpose is really twofold. Firstly, to explain the context for the data sheet that we issued alongside the protocols document. And both the protocol document and the data sheet, I know that my colleague Sophie Harrison is planning, if you haven't already, put it in the chat, a link to it in the chat if you don't have it. Or if that doesn't work, then if you just message Sophie Harrison in the chat and provide your email address, she can forward you a copy as well, or equally Stephen McKenzie. So in talking through that, Stephen, who's a new GHG specialist in our team, he'll talk through also the current state of play with available data, and particularly we've been looking at free to access data. And he'll also report back on the consultation feedback that we've received to date and our next steps from that. And at that point, we'll pause to see if there are any questions that have been arising. So please do submit any questions in the Q&A function or in the chat function. So I know Sophie's monitoring that. Stephen and I will be looking at that, and also some of the team from Deloitte that have been supporting this work. So please do keep questions coming. The second half is all about the ways that we need to look at to consider how do we improve data sources for purchased goods. So how do we move beyond just published emission factors? And specifically, I'm also going to be asking a question about where you think we should be focusing our efforts for the work programme for this year. Again, I'll pause for some Q&A time as well as issuing a poll at that point. So for now, first off, I'm just going to provide a bit of background context, and sorry if you were on the call this morning and you've already heard that. If so, you can have a brief snooze for a few minutes. But I wanted to explain that we started looking at this a couple of years ago, and We were talking to a lot of food and drink businesses who had set themselves GHG targets, net zero targets, or were looking at setting targets that encompass their supply chain scope 3 emissions, but they were all struggling with the same challenge on how to robustly track progress and understand if actions being taken are translating into emissions reductions. And we were also seeing a proliferation of different measurement approaches. We were seeing challenges with people, businesses in the supply chain facing multiple requests for information. A lot of this was causing concerns around uneven playing field and also acting as a barrier to progress, just causing inertia because of all the confusion. And we hadn't really identified a forum that convened different parts of the supply chain to discuss these kinds of challenges and work on forward ways of addressing them. At the same time, we were also seeing a huge number of increasing calls for transparency on supply chain data and for disclosure of information. But really what's needed to support that is more consistency in accounting, better information flows and access to more robust data, or data that are at least fit for purpose, and also just need to take significant care to ensure that the burden doesn't become too great on businesses in the supply chain, particularly on small producers further up the chain. So that was the context, and we, in response, established a new working group, or kind of a working community. I describe it because there's so many involved now. Importantly, includes voices from across the whole value chain, so from retail, hospitality and food service, manufacturers and processors, farming community, through a number of the farming bodies and industry bodies, government departments, wider industry bodies and NGOs. So a really large stakeholder group, which is really important in this space. So we, being guided by that group, agreed on a set of priorities for this year, one of which was to develop a more consistent set of scope 3 measurement and reporting principles, which we covered in the session this morning, and there should be a link to now. The session this afternoon is talking about, we got steered to pull together a common set of reference emission factors for different foods and ingredients. And we also have been steered towards considering the forward path for more systematic ways of collecting data along the supply chain. So that's what these bits are what we're going to be talking about this afternoon over the next hour. So just briefly to note, I'm sure most of you will know this, but why we're focusing specifically on purchased goods. Really because it's the most significant scope 3 category for many food and drink businesses. This is a snapshot or a sample of food and drink manufacturers, and really this scope 3 profile will be different for many different businesses dependent on type of business, but it's quite typical that purchased goods will be the most significant scope 3 category. So really the focus has been there. In terms of what we presented or proposed on purchased goods in the supporting consultation document, we've included really a guideline hierarchy of data sources for purchased goods. So that hierarchy starting with really primary data from suppliers, recommended particularly where sourcing from a dedicated supply chain, and particularly where it's a significant emission source. And we proposed a screening step to identify significant emission sources. We then, I guess at the bottom would be spend-based emission factors that we only recommend for gap filling. And we recognise that some of the levels in this hierarchy might not always apply, and actually it's dependent on really the quality of data available. So we've proposed an approach that is based on selecting data based on a data quality assessment, and we provided in the document a proposed data quality framework to do that. And I'll come on to some of these lines in a bit more detail later, but firstly we're going to be talking about this middle one, and which is emission factor from a published database of some variety. And the reason being, when we last consulted, this is where we were told by most businesses this is what they're currently using for their scope 3 purchase goods. So we got steered in our last consultation, sorry to move the slide. So we got steered, so yeah, most businesses are using published emission factors. We got told that it would be helpful to try and align on the published values that are being used. And so it would be useful for us to pull together values in one consistent data set and to make these publicly available, not as a requirement for use, but for use where alternative data are not available. So essentially that's what we've done. We've pulled together all of the freely available, free to access, publicly available data sources for food and drink products and ingredients into one place. But we're really only suggesting this as a starting point because we recognise there are significant issues with using average published values. And I've talked about this quite a lot if you've ever come to any of these meetings before, and I've shown this slide quite a lot because this is just a snapshot of, for some products, some of the publicly available data sources and some of the values presented in those databases, with the blue block showing some of the ranges within those databases, which if you look at the scale on the side is quite significant. Well, it's hugely significant actually. So the point being that these values are very variable. Stephen will talk to this more. It's hard for businesses to know how representative they are of their supply chain. Some of these choices are not black and white, and then also more fundamentally, these values don't change over time, so you can't use them to progress, understand how you're progressing over time as well. So there are significant limitations, so it's not the solution, but it's a starting point, and it reflects really the reality of where we are in terms of available data. So just to do a quick temperature check to see if that understanding is still the same. If you, Mina, could launch the first poll we have. I've got two questions for you. We wanted to know if you have quantified your scope 3 purchase goods emission factors for your emission for your business, yes or no, and if so, what data sources you used for food and drink items? Was it published emission factors mostly, entirely, or mostly? Was it data from suppliers? Was it a bit of a mix? Or do you not know if it was done on your behalf? And reason for asking is just, like I say, temperature check, just to check that we're still really working to the same starting point here. And then if we could show the results of the poll, Stephen's then going to talk next through the data sheet that we have compiled. Poll answers there, thank you, that's really insightful. I'll close that off and then move on to Stephen just to talk through what we've done on the emission factor database.
Thank you very much, Karen. So I'm also going to turn my camera off now as to not drive down any bandwidth. But so as Karen mentioned earlier, I'm just going to talk quickly about where we got to in sending this data sheet out for consultation, some of the responses that we got back, and some of the challenges that were keenly identified in those responses, which we really appreciate, and some of the actions that we're going to look to take in the short term in the next couple of months to try and address some of those issues for a version 1. And then after that, we'll hand back to Karen to talk about some of the longer term projects that we might be looking at to really get at some of the tricky things that are going on here. So that data sheet that was sent out was compiled in collaboration with Deloitte. And there are actually members of the Deloitte team who worked with RAP to pull that together on the chat now, available to answer questions as well. So what was sent out for consultation was taken from a variety of different data sources. Karen hinted at some of them earlier. They included, all of them were public and free to use. So they include public LCA databases, the FAO Global Livestock Environment Assessment Model, which has some outputs which you can use to make emission factors for livestock products from different regions of the globe, some large academic meta-analysis of different life cycle assessment and carbon footprinting studies of food products, and some specific reports that were particularly valuable for dealing with some of the key issues for products in UK food systems. And we're hoping, with that particular case in mind, that some of those reports and those values are going to be updated in the next couple of months, and we can maybe give updated information in that area. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what came out of that exercise of bringing all that information together was the data sheet that we sent out, which gives the user essentially a load of options for particular product groups based and emission factors based on different characteristics of either the product type, different data sources, the geographic region where the product came from, and in some cases, some issue on the production system on the farm. And that essentially adds up to quite a few, in some cases, emission factors for the same product, and also some variability on variations on a product to do with the processing. And that is, as I'll come on to in the when talking about the consultation feedback, one of the kind of key challenges to deal with and to make that a user-friendly kind of situation. And can we go to the next slide, please? So in terms of the balance of emission factors that were found, looking through the kind of food supply chain, the majority of the data and the emission factors that were pulled off were what we would call cradle to farm gate emission factors. So things representing food products as they're shipped from the farm gate, either for further processing or to go all the way down the supply chain to retail. But there were a decent number of emission factors found within those data sources for food products post-processing, so after specific forms of processing, and we call that well, we don't call that, it's known as cradle to processing gate in the kind of general terminology that's used in this area. So that's kind of where the bulk of the information lied, and that's where we've taken it from, and that is that's perfectly fine. It represents kind of where a lot of the carbon footprint of these products is coming from in those stages prior to kind of distribution and retail. So can we go to the next slide? So I'm now going to get in quickly to just some of a general overview of some of the consultation responses that we got back, and we really appreciated those, and some of them contained a lot more detail and specifics than the kind of information that I'm going to cover here. But there seemed to be a general feeling within the consultation that this resource could be useful, but a lot of suggestions for improvement and desire, particularly with the sensitive nature of data such as these, that it would be updated regularly. And that's something that we need to think about going forward as to how this resource might work. As I mentioned previously, there was a lot of feedback on this idea around lots of choices for the same product and variability in the values and the emission factors. And in some cases, a suggestion that it would be better received if we would curate that a bit more and think about presenting information for best available emission factors in the public data that was available. I'll come back to that in a bit about what we might be able to do to deal with that. that would be difficult for us to be the all-seeing eye across the database, but there might be some specific cases where the need is quite clear for it within UK food systems, where we could have a go at reviewing the available data on that. There were also some good really needed responses, just pointing out some of the methodological inconsistencies between some of the data sources going in. This is a long-standing problem in this area of carbon footprinting and environmental footprinting more generally. And I think one of the things that we can do in the short term is be clearer about some of the key methodological assumptions being made, but it's quite hard for us to go through and retroactively deal with all that, given some of the data sources that we're using. And there was also some suggestion that some suggestions about user friendliness and whether the data sheet in the Excel was the most appropriate form for that. And again, we can go back and look at how we give users this information in a way that's slightly easier to digest at the user level. But some of the suggestions that were given about making it kind of an online tool and stuff are things that we would have to think about in the longer term, rather than this immediate response to this round of consultation. Can we go to the next slide? So one of the key challenges that's been brought up, and Karen mentioned it earlier, is this variability between the data. And there's a coming together here of different challenges of variability in the data, lots of choice being presented, and wanting a bit more curation about the best available values. And what I would say here is that I've given the example on this slide of tomatoes, and even the variability for the emission factor for tomatoes within the same data source, in this case AgriBlaze, which is roughly methodologically, more or less methodologically consistent, but using different activity data that represents different properties of a production process, whether that be region, whether that be, in the case of tomatoes, in greenhouse or grown in field, and other things that are specific to the production process or the genotype, that we can't really say which is the best available value to use for a specific user case on this information. So there's quite a bit of variance in the activity data, in the emission factor being driven by the activity data. And that's the other point I wanted to make, is that's nothing to do with different methodological choices. That is just different options for input data into the same calculation. I think we can go to the next slide. But as I mentioned before, there is also methodological divergence between all these different data sources, and in some cases on some of the key issues that you would be looking at as sensitive assumptions for agricultural production systems and footprinting them, such as the method for allocating emission factors between different co-products coming out of the same process. For instance, one of the classic examples would be allocating emissions from growing soy between soybeans and soy oil, for an example, and also land use change and how that is dealt with in different ways between the different data sources. So I believe that we can kind of go and be a bit clearer in this sheet about the assumptions being made, but there are other projects going on, and we can mention those a bit later, that are looking to do a bit more harmonizing on the methodologies and provide some clearer guidance on this, which is much needed, really. So we can go to the next slide. And finally, one of the bits of feedback that we got specifically was on the data quality assessment. And again, this was feedback suggesting that it wasn't able, the way that it was done, because it was done at the data source level, effectively rating the quality of the data source overall, rather than for specific cases, specific food products. That it created some anomalies where a large LCA database was being rated using the same data quality method as a small, as a kind of individual sector specific value that had been put together using lots of kind of farm and industry data. And again, as part of the efforts to address that idea of there are certain key areas in this database where we might need to be a bit clearer on what the best available information is, we can look to try and deal with that. But I think there is also limits with a data set as large as this as to how specific we can go with the data quality score in the next couple of months. Okay, next slide. So just to cover the next steps for the database, I've hinted at quite a few of them there, but we're still hoping to launch this as part of the package with the Scope 3 guidelines, which we talked about in the earlier session this morning in April 2022. Based on the current feedback, we plan on improving various parts of this database, including providing more detail on potentially providing some more detail on the key sources of variance for key products contained within it. Some further review on the data quality issues within those key products, and some clearer information on the methodological choices being made by the data sources, and also to respond to some more general comments that we got about specific anomalies and the way that and quality within this. We'd be looking to remove further anomalies and ensure and do another sweep on data quality to go in. Some of you who had an eagle eye may have spotted such an anomaly in the first slide in a screenshot that I put up for the bananas. We'll be hoping, as I mentioned, to add in further data sources where key things are relevant, key reports that are supposed to come out in the next couple of months for UK food products, and to try and improve the presentation a bit to make it more intuitive for the user. So I think I am going to pause there. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so, oh yeah, that's Q&A bit. Right, I'm going to talk through a number of further steps that there are options that we could take, or efforts that we could place in improving data sources for purchased goods. And by each of them, I have put a question mark, because I've also got a poll question to ask about which of these you think it's most important that we do and place effort in. The reality is we're looking at all of these things, but I guess to give us a little bit of steer about which you think are most important, that would be very helpful. So the first is incorporation of the food steps database. And I noticed that Andrew is definitely on, from Food Steps is definitely on this webinar, possibly Anya. And the team there have done some really interesting work taking some of these underlying data sources for raw materials and ingredients like chicken or tomato and soya, and doing some work to turn those into, or generate emission factors for more processed products like soy sauce, tomato passata, or grilled chicken thighs, the examples here. So they have been building up a data set over time, and they've also been looking and assessing data quality and doing a lot of work on trying to improve the data quality of, or kind of align data quality of the underlying data sets. And some examples of the kinds of things that they have been doing are on this slide. So looking at the British consumption setting and weighting the data according to typical origin of food items consumed in the UK. Also looking at making the factors, I guess, more flexible to account for different geographic sourcing, and automatically taking into account additional transport emissions accordingly. looking at harmonizing some of the secondary data sources to make sure data are accounting for the same life cycle stages, which is something we've also been looking at. But I know the Food Steps team have put in more effort there. And like I said, for processed food items, in the absence of specific LCAs for these, they've built up some models to account for the additional processing steps of raw material. So processing, transportation, cooking, packaging. And there's some really valuable information, and they have offered to share with us to include in this data set. So that's one option, that we can build up this data, our data sheet over time, by including data sets like the Food Steps database. Another option, and this is a really interesting area, if you haven't heard of Hestia, the Hestia Platform, it's a really helpful platform, I guess is the right word for it, or tool, that essentially enables a more standardized way of incorporating, storing and presenting data that have been compiled across multiple sources. So farm surveys or research projects or LCAs or government data sets, all might have different methodological inconsistencies to them. And what Hestia does, it resolves some of these methodological consistencies across the data set. So it's kind of harmonizes them. And it's also got a really clever way of filling data gaps. And it was actually Joseph Poor from the kind of Poor and Nemechek fame that pulled this together, because I think he probably used it in pulling together all of the data sets in the Poor and Nemechek data set and used it as a way of harmonizing. So now this is an active platform that particularly is aimed at researchers and seeking to collate publicly available data sets. And we are proposing a project in the coming year to collate available data for particularly key import categories and source countries as a way of mining more data sets and seeking to get and generate more comparable values for key imports, which we could then add into the emission factor data sheet. So we, looking at the data that we have for import stats and using the approximate emission factors, we think that around 10 to 12 items as listed on this slide here account for around 50% of total emissions linked to UK imports. So actually covering a small number of ingredients or raw materials or products gives us quite a significant coverage in terms of importance in terms of UK import emissions. So we could focus there, and we could use Hestia to generate better values. And actually the value of Hestia as well is it includes time series data, for example, from government data sets. So actually could be used maybe to generate values that could be updated over time. So it's an important tool to try and explore the utility of, I feel. The next area, I think, is again ripe for further exploration, which is the concept of having industry approved emission factors. So I've defined these in the document as product level cradle to gate reference values published by an industry body as representative of average supply for a product or ingredient from a specific geography, with an example of the approach that Bod Beer and Origin Green, sorry, I missed a word out there, have reported data for Irish beef and Irish milk, and we've actually included that in the data sheet. And why that's valuable is that has actually got a huge and consistent sample of Irish beef farms and Irish dairy farms, such that actually that value, and they also update that value year on year, so it gives you a much more specific and probably kind of market average representative value for beef and milk sourced from Ireland. And there are a number of sector bodies that are considering compiling sector level average data from across their membership, which could then have the ability for them to be reporting year on year or periodic changes. So we know, for example, in the dairy sector, Dairy UK through the Dairy Roadmap are moving to actually quite a large proportion of UK dairy farms having been footprinted, and could potentially act as a consolidation point for that information. Equally, we've heard that Freshfel, which is the European fresh produce industry body, are considering collating data on behalf of the industry, which could be a really valuable resource. And as these develop, they could be incorporated into the food and drink emission factor data sheet and just give much more representative values, more updated values, but also really importantly, give an opportunity to have emission factor values that can be updated over time as the industry progresses. And for some businesses, if you're not sourcing from a specific integrated supply chain, those kinds of industry average values might be more appropriate for you to be using anyway, because it represents average supply. And if you're sourcing off the market, actually the market needs to be improving, and that's what this kind of data could reflect. There are challenges about ensuring methodologies align, for example, but it's an option for us to prioritise working with industry bodies to develop this approach, particularly for UK products. So I've included that in the mix. The next is probably one that's kind of a bit more of a halfway house. So development of what we're calling a proxy indicator approach, and we've included this in the document as well. So for some products, and this only applies to some products or ingredients, for some there are a really small number of critical data points that drive the majority of the relative emissions intensity. So tomatoes, Stephen noted earlier, the variability is actually driven a lot by production practices and inherent variances there. The KPI I guess the metrics that really drive those values are things like the proportion that are grown in heated systems, and within that energy per tonne, and also the percentage of renewable energy used in the mix. I guess also for non-heated systems, transport distance, particularly, for example, a sourcing from Southern Europe, will be a key variable. For things like chicken and pork, we know that two variables, footprint of feed and feed conversion ratio, actually drive about 80% of the footprint. And in instances where this applies, where actually a small number of variables really matter, there is potential that we could develop some really simple Excel-based calculators that could be used to adjust default secondary emission factors. So rather than asking always for full footprint values, actually collecting information on a smaller number of variables that are really more kind of management specific as well, could be an approach that could be taken. And we asked about testing this approach, and I think the feeling in consultation was that yes, but only for a limited number of key products, because it will only apply there, and don't put all our efforts in this kind of basket. Then finally, and this is just to note that this work is underway, is how we move on from reliance on secondary data sources, averaged or published values or proxy data, all of these things are shorter term solutions, and we need these shorter term solutions, but we also need collectively to be working out more systematic ways of collecting and verifying primary data along the supply chain. And we need that really because it's only by having that kind of information, that better data, that can enable better decision making. And also that kind of data is the only way we'll really be able to move into the space of incentivizing or rewarding actions that reduce emissions. We can only really do that if it's based on actual information from the supply chain. But it really needs careful thought to ensure it's governed appropriately, fair, proportionate to suppliers, not overburdening. And there is a lot of work that actually could inform such a system, I suppose. A lot of that's happening in the UK, particularly things like work that AHDB are doing on data sets, and others like Global Farm Metric, really working on the path forward here in the international context as well. But a key missing element we've seen so far is actually linking these up and having a clear vision of a forward path of where we need to get to and what the bits of the jigsaw to get there and how we link those bits together. Really encouragingly though, there may be a mandate for this, and there may be a home to govern this, and that may be provided within the National Food Strategy white paper. We'll have to see what it specifically says, but we know through discussions with DEFRA and others that is really being thought about in the right way, and the nature of the challenge around supply chain data is being recognised. So we're working with them to map out what that longer term vision could be, with a view to building that picture and then trying to get consensus of how we can make those things link up and how we can get there. But we see really encouraging things happening in that space. It will take time. It's 2 to 3 years off. So there are shorter term solutions and there are longer term solutions. I guess it's a really key point. So just again, to get a temperature check, and I'll issue a poll, and then I'll also come to the chat and the Q&A to see if there are any questions on what I've been presenting. But to explain the poll, there's one question, and you should be able to select hopefully as many options as you like. And brilliant, thanks Mina for launching that poll. If
No problem.
all that apply, and there is also a all of the above option, just to get a sense and a snapshot from you as to which of these things that I've described sound to you things that we should be exploring, particularly in more detail. We would be very keen for your opinions at this stage. What I will do is explain what our next steps are. And so we will publish the data sheet as a version 1 on RAT's website late April. So Stephen and the team will be picking up on the consultation responses and all of the points in the list that he went through earlier in terms of the things that we need to look at and revise or add to. That will be published alongside the version 1 of the Scope 3 measurement and reporting protocols. And then we will be piloting with Courtauld signatory businesses really to test all this out in practice. And we asked on the last call, if you'd like to be involved in piloting, let us know. So either Stephen or Sophie, got Sophie's contact details on the slide. Drop your contact details in the chat, or just let your RAP account manager know, and we'll be issuing some more information on those pilots over the next few weeks. We will issue periodic updates to the data sheet, and I have, and it's been proposed in the consultation responses that we do this annually, which I think probably sounds sensible, and we will add and we will build and improve on it over time. We'll be using continually the Courtauld GHG working group to steer further development efforts. And the next meeting of the Courtauld working group will be on the 6th of April, and we will use that to propose and agree the work programme for the coming financial year. And we will be drawing on the insights and the poll responses, but I think we've got some really good steer where we should be focusing on.